Hello everybody, I hope you're all enjoying the kindlier weather we're having here in the UK as opposed to the scary heat wave some of our friends in the Mediterranean are having. If you've booked your holiday, I hope you're going to somewhere tolerable. I was interested to see the other day that the temperature in the Canary Islands was only 28 degrees, whereas those in Rome are sweltering at 40 plus. Okay, I work for a number of charities with their property interests, both operational and investment property interests. And we saw some changes come into force last month to the regime under the Charities Act 2011 for a charity's disposal of property. If, as a non-exempt charity, as most UK charities are, the charity is selling property or granting a lease of property for more than 7 years, or granting a lease for 7 years or less at a fine or premium, or granting a lease for 7 years or less with an option to extend the lease, then in those circumstances, prior to 14th of June 2023, charity trustees were required to avoid the requirement for formal charity commission consent to the disposal. They were required to obtain and consider a written report on the proposed disposition from a suitable qualified surveyor. And they were also required to advertise the disposition in whatever manner the surveyor advised, and they were required to decide that they are satisfied, having considered the surveyor's report, that the terms on which the disposition is proposed to be made are the best that can be reasonably obtained for the charity. From the 14th of June, changes to section 119 of the Charities Act came into force, which to a fairly minimal extent, in my view, relax those requirements. Now, the charity trustees must still get a report, not necessarily from a qualified surveyor, but from a designated advisor acting exclusively for the charity. Now, a designated advisor must be a fellow or professional associate of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, or a fellow of the Central Association for Agricultural Valuers, the CAAV, or a fellow of the National Association of Estate Agents, Property Mark. And that advisor should have local expertise. He or she must have the ability in and experience of valuing similar land to that of the charity within the same area. Now, that designated advisor can now be a trustee, an officer, or an employee of the charity, but only if they meet the required level of one of those three professional bodies. It's still very much the case that the Charities Act report cannot come from any old trustee. It must come from a designated advisor. The changes to the Act also remove the automatic statutory requirement to advertise a proposed disposal as advised in the surveyor's report. The Act now simply says that the charity trustees should consider the report's recommendations, including how to advertise the disposal. Now, in practice, the change here is minimal and it reflects commercial reality, I think. I found that prior to the changes, surveyors were either ignoring the advertising requirement or they were advising that the advertising requirement wasn't necessarily because the marketing had already been done. So the changes mean that it's no longer a legal requirement to recommend advertising in the surveyor's report. And the charity trustees merely consider recommendations on advertising if there are any, but they don't have to follow those recommendations. So changes, but subtle changes over which we don't need to make excessive noise. 3 further bits of commentary for me. Number 1, all this legal paraphernalia relating to disposals are about disposals by charities, not disposals to charities. The questions charity trustees should be asking themselves when acquiring land are commercial ones. They're constitutional ones, but they're not statutory ones. Point 2. The requirement to obtain and consider the designated advisor's report must be satisfied before exchange of contracts, not merely before completion. I've been asked with urgent transactions where the seller is a charity whether we can make completion conditional on the providing of the designated advisors or the surveyor's report. But that's not lawful. The requirements must be satisfied before an agreement for sale, section 1191 of the Charities Act. And it follows that with an auction sale, when exchange of contracts is effected, when the hammer falls, the report needs to be issued and considered before the auction, and the trustees will need to set the reserve price at or above the designated advisor's lowest advised value for the land. And thirdly, 2 subpoints regarding leases. Firstly, I'd re-emphasise that the requirements I've been speaking of apply as well as to sales, but also to market rental leases for a term of more than 7 years. And that includes, I'm afraid, renewal leases under the 1954 Act for more than 7 years to the same tenant. A charity landlord is not exonerated from the requirement to comply with the Charities Act where it's renewing to the same tenant. For rat rental leases of 7 years or less, the requirements are lighter. The trustees must get a report from a person who they believe to have the ability and experience to give competent advice on the lease. That person can be a trustee, an officer, or an employee of the charity if the trustees consider that they have the right ability and practical experience. But that person doesn't, in that scenario, for leases of 7 years or less, need to have a professional qualification, although the Charity Commission recommends that they do. Going back to the June 2023 changes, not for any detail in this talk, but the changes also alter the way the regime applies to property held by multiple beneficiaries. They alter the rules for charity-to-charity disposals, and they vary the definition of connected persons for disposals where the rules always require an order of the Charity Commission, where you've got a disposal to a connected person. Those other changes, and the ones I've described in more detail today, are all encapsulated in the guidance on the Charity Commission website, and the guidance is called Selling, Leasing or Otherwise Disposing of Charity Land in England and Wales. And that's the main go-to document for property disposals by UK charities. It's a good thorough read, if not necessarily an entertaining one. I'll see you all again soon.